Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat live lecture. Dear friends, today's topic for discussion is Harold J. Laski and his political thought. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha has 25 years of teaching experience and his area of expertise is Indian political thought and political theory. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Jha to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to have on political thought of Harold Laski, a 20th century icon in political theory, in the sense that with the rise of welfare state and welfarism and the emphasis on the positive content of freedom and other aspects, Laski, who essentially cannot be considered to be a purely liberal thinker, became important for the discourse on freedom, rights, and so on and so forth. But Laski, in fact, is a very important thinker otherwise also, particularly from the point of view of political science, because he is one of those thinkers, in fact, who engaged with the actual politics, the day-to-day politics, or considered politics as an instrument for the transformation of society, economy, and so on and so forth. So, it is not just a coincidence that Laski, who was professor and subsequently also director of London School of Economics and Political Science, also became the chairman of British Labour Party. And during his chairmanship, in fact, the British Labour Party came back to power as a majority parliamentary party, and that was not a mean achievement for someone who was heading the political party, which formed the government during his time. So, in fact, one can see that how Laski not only theorized, not only reflected, not only imagined political system and political ideas, but also basically try to implement them through the actual exercise of political action. So, therefore, in Laski's thought we get a combination of both theory and practice. What normally is considered in the Marxian lexicon as praxis, we can see it getting translated in concrete terms in Laski's political thought. So, therefore, Laski is a very important thinker. Now, of course, Laski is interesting in other sense also, because we find a evolutionary graph or a checkered intellectual journey of Harold Laski. Started as a pluralist believer in pluralism, pluralist political philosophy, having influenced by Maitland and other thinkers, and ended up as a socialist who believed in the Marxian doctrine of state devolution and so on and so forth, though he never basically got transformed to a communist who believed in this Leninist doctrine, or who uncritically endorsed or subscribed to this Soviet brand of communism, which was basically on ascendancy during his time. But nonetheless, certain changes which were taking place in the world, on the world scene, particularly within capitalism, particularly after the great economic depression, particularly after the rise and advent of Hitler and Mussolini, the fascism and Nazism. In fact, there was a massive impact on all these developments on Laski's political thought, which transformed his entire thinking, and something which he had started, which he had initially rejected, that is Marxism, and believed that Marxism and democracy are incompatible. In fact, he believed that the dictatorship of proletariat is totally a bunkum concept. But later on, when he discovered that capitalism was growing from crisis to crisis, and this marriage or alliance between capitalism and democracy, basically this marriage was a very inconvenient or incongruous marriage, and therefore, it was leading to a kind of catastrophic situation. Therefore, he started believing that a strong state and a basically unified center of authority capable of delivering in terms of bringing social and political democracy would be perhaps be the order of the day, and therefore, he started revising or basically revisiting some of his earlier opinion and earlier perceptions about Marxism and so on and so forth. So, we will basically come to these issues later. But before that, we should have let us have a look at Laski's intellectual career, because that also is important for understanding any person's political thought. As we have seen that he died in 1949, and so basically his most creative and fruitful years were in 20th century, the first part of the 20th century. He was teaching at London School of Economics and Political Science, which at that time used to get a lot of students from so called third world countries, including India. Therefore, Laski's influence, in fact, one could see more in the peripheries in these third world countries like India than perhaps in England, but that does not mean that Laski was not a very known and known face or had an imposing presence in England. For example, he used to write for popular newspapers. He used to produce popular writings, so much so that it is basically the kind of a volume which was edited in his memory after his death. There was a piece which mentioned that basically a worker in this Edinburgh, he mentioned that he used to read most of the pieces of Laski's newspapers, and he considered that this person was basically thinking along the same line as that particular worker was thinking. Only difference was that he was articulating it in a much more systematic and coherent way. So, that basically tells you that how he had his finger on the pulse of the people, how he knew that what people were thinking, and that is why he is basically connect with this entire industrial working class to basically which he championed through his association with the Labour Party, was basically unwavering and continued till his death, even if in fact he himself was not a worker or basically he was not a trade union leader, but nonetheless his association with the Labour Party basically established that connect between his intellectual life as well as his political activism. He was a prolific writer. In fact, in one sense one can say that he was an iconoclast who basically demolished the established perceptions about many ideas, about many things. In fact, he was versatile in terms of the range of his interest and in terms of the writings which he produced, from government to institutions to pure political theory and philosophy to history and so on and so forth. Now, what happens that this combination of theory and practice which I was mentioning in the beginning is something very significant in Laski's political thought, because he did not believe that the job of a political theorist or a political scientist is only to theorize or to reflect, but he always believed that the true social science has to basically engage with the real politics, the day-to-day politics, the activity in society, and therefore this theory and practice combination is quite significant in Laski, and therefore many people believe that he upheld certain principles and he lived his principles. In fact, those principles he wanted to basically translate into action, and therefore what happens that we can see that those principles are basically to be seen in terms of the real action which he basically demonstrated through his political engagement. Now, so far as this impact of writings are concerned, of course, there are a number of writings which can be credited to Laski, from political authority to freedom to basically the revolution. But the most important and the systematic writing which is still basically used for political science is the grammar of politics, where he has basically reflected and discoursed on number of issues which are the core concerns of political theory and political science. So, therefore, grammar of politics continues to be perhaps the most important link between Laski's intellectual product, intellectual journey, and basically the subsequent generations of political scientists and the political theories. So, far his impact is concerned, his impact was profound in the third world countries. As I mentioned, that many people, many leaders of these third world countries at one stage or some stage were associated with London School of Economics. So, even if they were not directly a student of Laski, but they were definitely familiar with his ideas, or somehow they came into contact with his ideas, his writings, and were tremendously influenced. And therefore, you find that Laski to great extent evolved or became a legend. In fact, in these societies, in these countries, and many people believe that Laski was a professor sant who taught socialism to his students in a very simple and in a profound manner, in the sense that in a very first inaugural introductory lecture, he used to declare his basically biases, his preferences, and his commitment, when he used to say that I am a socialist, and therefore that reflected his honesty, intellectual honesty, that what he basically believed he wanted to share with his students. As a teacher, of course, he was immortalized. In fact, he met the test of Socrates in terms of the requirement of a teacher, that a great teacher has to act as a midwife of minds and spirit of his students, and basically he wanted to conduct himself as a teacher in the true fashion of this Socratic principle. Now, as a leader of the Labour Party, in fact, we must basically understand one thing, that apart from his academic activity and academic commitment, he was continuously engaged with the political process, or the politics of democratic politics of England, and he considered Labour Party to be reflecting his ideological preferences and principles, that was socialism, and therefore he joined Socialist Party. Now, he considered Labour Party as a kind of representative of the socialist movement in that part of the world, and therefore, in fact, he was elected to the National Executive in 1936, and subsequently he became the chairman of the Labour Party in 1945. As I mentioned in the beginning, that during his chairmanship, Labour Party came back to power as a majority parliamentary party. In fact, it had formed the government earlier also, but as a clear-cut majority, this was the first instance, and that happened during his chairmanship. Now, so these things are important for understanding his political thought or his intellectual journey, because someone like Laski, who didn't consider only writing books or basically delivering lectures, or basically only act of a thinker, he didn't consider to be in an act of reflection or imagination, but also that how those reflections and imaginations are basically brought to bear on the real political action. This is perhaps how he looked at the role of a theorist or a philosopher or a political scientist. So, therefore, these things are important for understanding his political thought. Now, as I mentioned, that he didn't only produce pure academic and theoretical writings, but as a journalist, he was continuously he was producing pieces for popular newspapers, and this is how he used to connect with the various strata of society, including the working class. And this is how I mentioned that how the workers reacted to his writings, because they thought that perhaps he was speaking their ideas. Of course, in a more systematic and coherent way. So, therefore, in fact, we find that he had a multifaceted personality. But one thing is very clear from the very beginning, that as I have mentioned, that there were three important influences on basically Laski's political ideas. People say, scholars say that Mill, Maitland, and Marx, the 3M, perhaps were the three great influences on Laski. Maitland's pluralism, the political pluralism, J.S. Mill's individualism, and Karl Marx's particularly socialism. The three were the abiding concerns of Laski throughout his intellectual journey. But one thing is very clear, one can find a clear-cut rupture in his political thought happening midway, and that rupture is between his pluralism and his socialism. Now, the pluralism, because there was a time when Laski believed that his entire discourse of monism, the monistic theory of sovereignty, as it was propounded by Baudin, Hobbes, and of course Austin, that doctrine was basically flawed, and therefore that required revision and a thorough critique. And this is what he did through his espousal of this pluralism as a political philosophy, where the state has to share its authority and sovereignty with various multiple groups in society, and all those groups have identity of their own, and those identities cannot be undermined and diminished. But subsequently or gradually we can see that there is a transformation in Laski's political thought, that this transformation we can see taking place, or a movement, there is a shift from pluralism to, I will not call it monism, because even if he started believing that a state has important role to play in social and economic transformation, but nonetheless he did not blindly endorse that monism which he had rejected in the beginning, but nonetheless there was marked difference or shift in his position on this thing, particularly with reference to authority and the state power. We will basically turn to this issue later. But one thing is very clear here, that in spite of these transformations and these changes, so far as the critique of capitalism is concerned, Laski was unwavering in terms of this commitment, because he remained a trenchant critique of capitalism, because he believed that liberty has to coexist with equality, or liberty can have meaning only when it is basically combined with equality, justice and other similar values. And he believed that the way capitalism as a system operates, the chances of this combination are very bleak, and therefore he believed that capitalism has to make way for something different, a different way of distribution of resources, a system where a more just social order can be created. In fact, a lot of scholars believe that no one in this Anglo-American world, in England and America, perhaps attacked capitalism more fiercely than perhaps Laski. Of course, earlier Marx did, but in fact he was German and his political thought is associated with German political thought. But in Anglo-American world, no one perhaps critiqued capitalism as basically severely as perhaps Laski did. Now, in order to basically get rid of capitalism, he also thought of having a united front of socialists and the communists, particularly during those crucial years of 1934 to 39, when basically Europe was in turmoil, when Hitler and Mussolini were on the scene and capitalism was in deep crisis. So, therefore, this fascism as a context, in fact as a new development during his time, basically was important factor in transforming his entire thinking in direction of a new route to basically establish a humanitarian social order. Of course, one thing is very clear, that in fact Laski has also been critiqued by a number of schools, a number of scholars subscribing to different schools of thought. For example, the idealists refused to consider Laski as a political philosopher, because they believe that Laski was not a system builder. His writings and his ideas are basically in bits and pieces scattered here and there. They are not coherent as perhaps a system builder is perhaps required to do. Therefore, in fact, he cannot be considered a political philosopher. There is no a priori thinking in, no a priori argument or a rationalist concept in Laski. Therefore, in fact, this entire exercise of political philosophy remains short of its required criteria. Now, a lot of scholars also believe that Laski mastered a lot of empirical fact to explain the functioning of the state, particularly the capitalist state, and therefore one can say that he in a true fashion made use of the scientific method in social science or in political science. And therefore, many scholars believe that it is better to call Harold Laski a political scientist than a political philosopher, because he did not believe simply in abstract political analysis or explanation. Rather, he believed in combining abstractions with empirical argument and empirical explanation. Therefore, the scientific dimension in Laski's political thought, many people believe, was quite prominent, something which in fact for which even Aristotle even today is remembered as the father of political science, who basically not only classified government, but laid the foundation for this new tradition of analysis. But Laski in modern times is considered to be perhaps the pioneer in field of using this empirical data in providing explanations based on empirical facts and so on and so forth. So, therefore, in fact these are some of the limitations which are often highlighted. We will basically turn to some other criticisms also later, particularly in terms of this rupture in his political thought between this pluralism and Marxism, which happens later in his life. Now, influences, we have already seen that J.S. Mill, a great British political theorist and thinker, whose ideas on particularly freedom and other things influence many generations of political thinkers, and Laski was no exception. So, Laski was influenced by J.S. Mill, along with, one can say, to some extent also Green's moral freedom. The way Green understood and defined freedom as a moral development of personality, or the way Green considered this freedom in fact as something which comprises of a harmonious relationship between individual and the community. So, therefore, in fact Green's moral freedom also one can see influencing Harold Laski to some extent, but J.S. Mill's in fact argument about this freedom as absence of restraint in some certain spheres of life, particularly freedom of thought and expression, freedom of action. So, these things were of tremendous influence, tremendous value to Laski, and therefore, even if he later on converted to Marxism as in the sense that he considered Marxian analysis of society and economy to be quite important, but nonetheless his individualism, his tremendous faith in this individual autonomy and freedom did not allow him to endorse what was happening in Soviet Union under the Bolshevik, after the Bolshevik revolution, under the influence of Lenin and other protagonists of the Bolshevik revolution. So, therefore, this this freedom dimension in his political thought remained unwavering, and here one can see the influence of J.S. Mill in a big way. Of course, there are many other influences as well. For example, the influence of Fabianism, the guild socialism, syndicalism, because in terms of this equalization of resources or the participation of workers in decision making, particularly the influence of Proudhon, the French philosopher, or one can say the G.D.H. Cole, the Fabian and the guild socialist voice of the period. In fact, Sidney Webb, Bernard Shaw, and many other, the Fabian thinkers, personalities of his period. They of course influenced him through his ideas, though he considered Fabianism as a gradual change or gradual liquidation of capitalism, or gradual or the change or transition in society to the instrumentality of parliamentary path to be inadequate, that he considered later. But initially he was very much influenced by that idea, that how this parliamentary politics, how this representative democratic politics could lead to the gradual and the peaceful transition to a better system where the working class could be made more secure, where their participation in the governance, where their participation in decision making could be guaranteed, and therefore, in fact, this equalization of resources, a more equitable distribution of resources could happen. But later on he believed that there were limitations in these things, particularly the way the British and American parliamentary and presidential systems were functioning. So, therefore, we will turn to this, that how he believed that United States of America and the Great Britain or the British parliamentary system, even he was disappointed with the functioning and conduct of the Labour Party, and this disappointment led him to believe that these ideologies perhaps did not have the potential to herald a new era for human society. Similarly, he was also critical of Soviet Union, particularly the dictatorship of proletariat, in spite of the fact that during this interwar period, particularly in 30s, when this fascism and Nazism had emerged, and that has posed a great danger, a challenge to democracy and liberal values. He believed that in fact this alliance between this united front between the socialists and the communists, and subsequently after war he believed that the alliance between United States of America, Britain and many West Asian countries, many European countries, and also a kind of cooperation between Soviet Union and these countries which had existed before the Second World War should continue because of the need of the society and need of the democracy. But when that he didn't find it happening. So, he was thoroughly disappointed, the way he was disappointed with American and the British political systems, on which he reflected, which he wrote upon, and we will discuss it, that how he critiqued both the presidential system and the parliamentary system in the Britain and presidential system in United States of America. So, therefore, in terms of influences, we have seen that there are many influences, but three influences are often referred, that is J.S. Mill, Maitland and Marx. Now, so far as this Laski political thought is concerned, he believed that the earlier epoch, the earlier era belonged to political democracy, capitalism and nationalism. That was basically, they were the signposts of the old world, whereas the modern world, the new world in which he was basically writing and the world which he was engaging, he believed that it was economic democracy, socialism and internationalism which were basically the buzzword or which were the signposts of this new world. Now, in fact, therefore, he considered himself to be a writer or a thinker who was reflecting on this transition, and therefore, many scholars believe that he was a political philosopher in age of transition. Now, in fact, many people believe that there is some amount of similarity between Rousseau and Laski. For example, the way Rousseau criticized monarchy in France, and in fact, by criticizing monarchy, he basically didn't realize that the remedy lay in revolution, and therefore, only revolutionary changes could basically get rid of the problems which he had diagnosed, but he started finding solution elsewhere. Now, similarly, for Laski, a lot of people believe that he considered this capitalist democracy and imperialism. He found a relationship between capitalist democracy and imperialism, but he didn't realize that this remedy lay in this revolutionary overthrow of this capitalist democracy and imperialism, which many scholars believe that he should have, because if he was going closer to Marxism, then perhaps this was the natural option left for a thinker to arrive at, conclusion to arrive at, but he didn't do that. But now we feel that if he didn't consider a revolutionary overthrow of capitalist democracy or imperialism as perhaps the communist ideology of that time believed, in fact, there must be some reason, because a very astute thinker which Laski was, he must have understood the limitation of this violent revolution, that how violence would beget more violence, and therefore, he was not quite comfortable with this revolutionary overthrow of capitalist democracy which was being propagated and championed by the communist ideology of the day. Now, therefore, we find that continuously he believed in change, he believed in social transformation, but he always basically propagated or basically relied on peaceful political and social change. Now, this peaceful transition, in fact, he thought that would be possible with the help of parliamentary socialist party. And it is not just a chance that we find that Laski participated and joined this Labour Party largely on account of this fact that this peaceful transition could be perhaps hastened, or perhaps the Socialist Party could use this parliamentary channel to bring about changes in society, the peaceful changes for in the interest of the people. Now, he also believed in the peaceful abrogation of imperialism through agencies like League of Nations and other things of those years. Of course, these hopes were also belied, but then one shouldn't forget that the kind of diagnosis which he was making about the alliance between capitalism, imperialism and other things, along with retaining his commitment for freedom and other similar values of liberalism, was some sort of an achievement at that time. So, therefore, his entire purpose was to establish social democracy and combining social democracy with political democracy, and therefore, in fact, his influence was gradually felt when people realized that the biggest limitation of political democracy is the absence of social democracy, and the biggest lacuna which the social democracy suffers, even if in some countries the social democracy comes into existence, is basically divorced from political democracy. So, this combination of political democracy and social democracy, how important it is, in fact, gradually people started realizing, and Laski was quite alive of this situation from the very beginning, and therefore, one can see the significance of his political thought. Now, coming back to this question of pluralism, which I was referring, that in a beginning we find that Laski had tremendous belief, tremendous faith in this doctrine, that in society there is no one center of authority, or there is no one identity, there is no one group. And he, like pluralists, he believed that a state is association of, among various associations, a group among various groups like any other groups, like church, or for that matter, many other social groups which are in society. The state should share its power and authority and sovereignty to those groups. And if this is done, then it will be better from the interest of freedom and rights. Now, these pluralists had tremendous influence on Laski, particularly Maitland. Now, Laski believed that status and privileges of particular social groups in organized political community should be recognized. Now, this doctrine of sovereignty, which was basically at the center of this entire discourse, which was propounded by Baudin and Hobbes, and subsequently most systematically by Austin, was subjected to rigorous criticism by these pluralists, because this entire theory of sovereignty, which is known as monistic theory of sovereignty or monism, was considered to be detrimental from the interest of freedom, individual freedom as well as group freedom or the group rights, and therefore, it was subjected to criticism. Now, in a paper or in a piece which he wrote as Problems of Sovereignty, Laski's plea was for religious freedom. Now, he wanted autonomous functioning of all religious sects, in fact, in the sense that a state should be kept aloof from sectarian connections, and therefore, he thought that if such situation arises, when all such religious sects are given freedom and they are not under the strict vigilance or under control of the state, or the state keeps itself away from such sects, then it will be good in the interest of social peace, harmony as well as individual freedom. He was also against the patronage to the Anglican Church of England, which was being given by the state in England. So, therefore, in fact, in this pluralism, we find that Laski was quite clear that the various groups in society, and a state is one such groups, which is basically the classical position of pluralist, and therefore, he believed that those groups should be accorded their proper place. And this monistic theory of sovereignty, he believed, had a context. It emerged at a time when there was a kind of conflict, the religious conflict, particularly in the 16th century, particularly the conflict among various groups, various sects, various religious sects, and therefore, within the context of that turmoil, it was the requirement of that age to consolidate this state power and state authority, and therefore, this entire concept of sovereignty, the monistic concept of sovereignty had to be propounded, and Baudin, Hobbes and subsequent theorists have to be seen in that light. And therefore, he believed particularly in another interesting piece which he wrote, that is the foundations of sovereignty, he traced its evolution and believed that it had a context, but that context no longer exists, and therefore it needs a new look, a new revision, and therefore he argued in direction which basically puts him in company of those pluralist political thinkers. Now, when it comes to political authority, Laski saw this as a wider problem, and in fact he considered this modern state, which was to some extent was basically the offshoot of this discourse, such discourses like monistic theory of sovereignty, or the kind of discourse which culminated into this idealist political philosophy of Hegel and many others. He believed that the modern state was posing a great threat and danger to freedom, as perhaps the papal authority at one point of time might have posed. That is the kind of threat which was emanating from church and the supremacy of the Pope in Europe at one point of time, which led to this consolidation of this concept of sovereignty. Now, similar threat today is emerging from the state from a different point of view, particularly to the concept of freedom. And so, therefore, this has to be countered, and it is in this context, the context of the wider implication of this the threat, and this entire argument or the discourse on political authority led him to imagine and visualize a different type of social order, and perhaps this is how he started arguing for a concept like federalism and so on and so forth. So, this federalization as a conception of political authority, in fact, in terms of diffusion of political power, responsibility, in fact, we find materializing in Laski's political thought largely on account of his diagnosis of this problem of authority and power in modern times, particularly emanating from the modern state. So, therefore, this entire contextualization of the authority and power and the sovereignty and the modern state led Laski to believe that unless there is a new way in which this power, authority and responsibility are redistributed in society, there is no escape from this malady, and therefore he argued for federalization of political authority instead of concentration it in a single center, that is a unified monistic center, that is perhaps the bedrock of this entire monism. Now, this suspicion of the monistic state, interestingly, in fact remained a abiding theme in Laski's political thought, even when he converted to Marxism or started believing in some of the principles of Marxism, particularly when Europe was in turmoil and crisis, particularly after or before the Second World War, after rise of fascism and Nazism, when he believed that for securing freedom and protecting democracy, in fact socialism of not a gradual type or gradual transition which he perhaps advocated earlier, but a new way to bring about changes in society, and this is how he went closer to Marxism, which at one point of time he had dismissed. He believed that Marxism and democracy are totally antagonistic concepts. This was his early phase, but subsequently he revised his opinion. Of course, he never felt comfortable with Leninist theory of dictatorship of proletariat. He never felt comfortable with the Soviet system and undermining of freedom and democracy. But nonetheless, so far the Marxian principles of reconstruction of social order in terms of equality, justice and so on and so forth, he went quite close to those principles which Marx had championed. But nonetheless, this suspicion, so far as the monistic state is concerned, continued even in this phase, that is referred as the Marxian phase, because he believed that concentration of power in few hands in fact always result into a threat to ordinary citizens. And largely on account of this suspicion of this monistic state, we believe that, or we find that Laski never endorsed this dictatorship of proletariat argument of Lenin. So, therefore, Leninists take on political party or for example, the way the socialist state in Soviet Union was functioning, he was not quite happy with that, and therefore he did not endorse it. But nonetheless, his suspicion of the monastic state was perhaps a abiding theme in his political thought. So therefore, we find that Laski was a great champion of federalization. He was a great champion of decentralization of political power, and largely because his commitment for individual freedom was unwavering, and he always believed that individual freedom could be protected if there is decentralization, if there is dispersal, and if there is no concentration in few hands or in few centers. So therefore, dispersal of political and economic power, in fact, one can say, was the distinctive contribution of Harold Laski to modern political theory, to which we will turn later, because in recent times or in modern times we find that these two themes are so important that entire political theory is exercised with this issue, that how democracy can be made more progressive, how more democratic contents can be brought into the political discourse in modern times. And the two themes which are very important in today's discourse, one is this federalization and another is this participation, decentralization, and so on and so forth, particularly from the point of view of various interests in the society, including group or individual interests. And this is how we can see the subsequent growth and evolution of liberalism in 20th century, or the way it is moving in 21st century. And it is on this account that we find that Laski's contribution were far reaching, that he was ahead of his time when he recognized the value of both. In fact, during a time when there were not very few admirers of these things, or at least its value was not being seen as perhaps it is seen today. Now, coming to this question of individualism, which I mentioned in the very beginning, the three influences on Laski, in fact, Mill, Maitland, and Marx, and this individualism is largely from this liberal tradition. Of course, one can say Mill. Of course, there were some influences of Green also, as I have mentioned, this personality, the moral freedom, the concept, the entire concept of this development of personality, or the kind of moral content of freedom. So these things which Green talked of also left some influence on Laski, but this individualism, which we find is a running theme in Laski's political thought, and therefore he becomes quite interesting, that how he is trying to combine individual with groups, individual interest with the group interest, how he is trying to combine this individualism which is subsequent brush with Marxism, and therefore these combinations at times appear to be contradictory, sometimes these combinations appear to be totally illogical, and this is how perhaps the critics look at him. But nonetheless, one can see the value of these combinations, because even today we understand that any progressive, any meaningful, any liberal discourse, or any discourse which is liberative or humanitarian has to combine values of different traditions, and then only perhaps human society could be made more livable, or could be made more human or more democratic. So this individualism in Laski also, we find that he was uncompromising on this. He was the great votary and supporter of the social groups, autonomy of social groups, but at the same time he was also thoroughly committed for the dignity of human personality. He always believed that human personality is not to be sacrificed on the altar of any other good. Now, as an individualist, he believed in the freedom of thought and action, which, as I mentioned, that were great values for John Stuart Mill. Now, even if he supported the Marxian analysis of society, but he opposed the Leninist theory of proletarian dictatorship, as I mentioned just now. Now, because of this type of individualism, the streak of individualism in Laski's political thought, that we find that he always believed that there was danger in blind obedience. In fact, this blind obedience, which normally a state asks for, in fact, he always contested it. And this individualism, in fact, perhaps was the reason or the basis for this kind of rejection of this blind obedience, which normally the idealists or the communitarians, or for that matter even the kind of Marxism which was being practiced in Soviet Union required. So, therefore, in fact Laski believed that individual must consult his conscience before he renders obedience to the sovereign. So, therefore, he was not for unqualified obedience to the sovereign, because he found lot of dangers in it. Now, in Grammar of Politics, his perhaps magnum opus, most celebrated book from the point of view of political theory and political science, he writes that liberty is absence of restraints, and this definition of liberty puts him in company of the great liberal thinkers like Mill and many others, but it is largely on account of his criticism of Hegel's concept of freedom, and he called it a dialectical fraud, because for Hegel freedom is obedience of the state, which he had declared as march of God on the earth. So, therefore, in this context he is basically talking of this freedom, but in fact he did not leave freedom in this shape, that absence of restraint. He gave a positive content to it, freedom of his mind or body, which is basically John Stuart Mill used to say, but Laski believed that freedom implied the conditions as well, not only restraints, but conditions as well. And therefore, in fact subsequently when this positive concept of freedom evolved within liberalism, we find that Laski's ideas gradually were picked up and considered very significant from the point of this thing. Now, so far as the question of property is concerned, Laski wanted lot of checks and lot of control and lot of lot of checkmating of this property, because he wanted universalization of enjoyment of liberty, and he believed that property could be the biggest impediment on the path of this enjoyment. So, therefore, he wanted control and various mechanisms through which it could be checkmated, and this ran contrary to what the idealists believed, or contrary to what some liberals also believed, like Locke and many others had argued earlier, and subsequently also you find that many liberals, even the utilitarian philosophers or like Bentham and others, in fact so far as the property is concerned, they would basically simply endorse accumulation and endless accumulation of property, but Laski believed that it was detrimental to liberty, and it is here we find that he breaks from whole host of liberal scholars and liberal tradition, including John Stuart Mill, on the question of property. And this is what we find happening in Laski on the question of the relationship between equality and liberty. And in fact he rejected laissez-faireism, he rejected conservative idealism, both doctrines which supported this type of endless and uncontrolled accumulation of property. And he believed in a progressive liberalism. He also believed that the progressive liberalism of Hobhouse, or basically reformist collectivism of Fabianism, in fact were also not fully perfect in terms of bringing industrial democracy or democracy among the masses, particularly the industrial sections. Now, in fact the criticism of general will, which Rousseau had basically talked of and subsequently became one of the important theme in political theory, he considered this general will as fiction, because he believed that will is not of one type, but there are multiplicity of wills, and therefore in fact there are class contents in the will, and one cannot say that all wills can be combined into one general will, and that general will, obedience to that general will become freedom, as perhaps Rousseau had argued, and he believed that this entire doctrine of general will was dangerous for freedom. Now, when it comes to the actual government and actual process of administration or authority, we find lot of pragmatism in Laski's political thought, and therefore that pragmatism can be seen in terms of espousal of the social democracy, that is decentralization and political power, decentralization of political and economic power within the community. Now, so far the representative institutions are concerned, whether it is a parliamentary form of government in Britain or the presidential form of government in United States of America, he wanted a greater participation of the people, because he believed that both systems were suffering from that drawback in spite of many achievements, in spite of many qualities. The biggest lacuna, the drawback of this system was participation of the people. Now, he believed to some extent in guild socialism of GDS Cole and others, so far as this industrial democracy within the industry is concerned, in terms of the participation of workers in the decision making in the factories is concerned, so far as the syndicalism of Sorel and many others. In fact, he also saw a lot of merits in them, but nonetheless gradually he started realizing the limitation of these doctrines in terms of the transformation of society in direction of social and political democracy or creation of equality in different spheres of life. Now, his interest in Proudhon and Fabianism, as I mentioned, that Fabianism is also referred as one of the important influences on Laski, because that was Fabianism after all is a doctrine which believes in gradual and peaceful change, evolutionary process of change, and many evolutionary socialists are basically have had the beginning in this Fabianism. In fact, India's first Prime Minister Nehru, a lot of people believe that he also was greatly influenced by Laski and Fabianism, and therefore he also believed in that evolutionary transition to socialism. As I mentioned in the very beginning, many third world country leaders who at that point of time were exposed to Laski's ideas, who at some stage were associated with his professorship at London School of Economics and Political Science, they got influenced by such ideas, the evolutionary and the gradual transition to socialism in society. But gradually we find that when these influences were on Laski, there was little influence of Marx, because he believed Marxism was incompatible with democracy, and he provided a trenchant critique of Russian Revolution as well. But the more he came to acknowledge the importance and significance of Marxian thought in terms of its critique of capitalism, and the more he realized the limitation of capitalist democracy in the West, in fact, he gradually started moving away from his earlier influences of Fabianism, guild socialism, and so on and so forth. And finally, he started coming closer to this libertarian socialism. Socialism, he believed, is libertarian. It is not authoritarian, and it is largely because of this perception or this understanding of socialism as libertarian that he saw limitations even in the socialist model, because he believed that if socialism is libertarian, then how could it become authoritarian? And the kind of dictatorship of proletariat or kind of Stalinist Russia which he saw, he believed that it was not in true sense a socialism. So, freedom and equality, he believed, are inseparable. For the cause of equality, the freedom could not be sacrificed. So, ethical individualism, political pluralism, and economic collectivism, one can say, finally remained with him in his political thought. The ethical individualism in terms of the freedom and autonomy of individual, political pluralism in terms of this decentralization or power, authority, and the way he demolished this concentration of power in few hands or at any one center, and economic collectivism, the kind of community initiatives, kind of collectivities, or the kind of collective action or the collective interest, the societal interest, which perhaps was largely on account of his belief in socialism. So, three values or three, in fact, the principles remained with him in spite of many changes which we have seen over the years happening in his political thought. They switch over to Marxism when he renounced Fabianism and provided, decided or basically took to a conciliatory approach to Marxism. In fact, particularly when he saw Democracy in Crisis, and this is perhaps the title of the paper which he wrote, Democracy in Crisis, and he critiqued gradualist thesis of Fabianism because he believed that these things could not check the rise of Hitler or Mussolini or fascism and Nazism, and therefore he not only critiqued Fabianism and gradualist approach, but he started critiquing parliamentary democracy in England, particularly this presence of House of Lords as a hereditary chamber, the institution of monarchy, now this tradition of tolerance, and many other principles on which the British parliamentary system were based, and believed that all of them required a new look, a new revision. Similarly, in fact, he also critiqued United States of America, particularly its checks and balances system, the Supreme Court using its veto, and all these things he believed that were not in the interest of citizenship rights. So therefore, we find that Laski had a very checkered intellectual journey during which he provided number of ideas and refreshing thought, basically on number of issues which are very significant from the point of view of political theory today. I'll stop here.
I would like to thank sir for this enriching discussion, and thank you dear friends for watching. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.